Hey, Sojourn, Reed here with another supplemental Revelation teaching. We already talked about how our interpretive approach to the book is to look at it as a cyclical, these 7 cycles of the global phenomenon from Christ's resurrection and ascension to his return, which we are still looking forward to. Now I want to talk about some different interpretive approaches that are really mainstream. And you'll see these don't fit into a specific sermon because specific sermons deal with specific texts, but they're really an overview of how we approach the entire book. And I'm going to present 5 of them from various resources that I've used to kind of develop a little bit of a working definition for each of these 5. And show you why that 5th one is the one that we are using. So the first is called the preterist view. Praetor comes from a Latin word or preterism comes from a Latin word which means the things that have passed. So the preterist view of Revelation looks at the book as almost completely having been fulfilled already. Usually they look at Revelation as having already been completely fulfilled in the events of AD 70 when Rome conquered Jerusalem and destroyed the temple in AD 70. They can also look at it as the fall of Rome. Some preterists look at it as the fall of Rome, which happened in like the 5th century. But generally, the preterists look at the whole book of Revelation and say, yeah, this already happened. There's some exceptions with the end of the book. Obviously, that's talking about something that has not happened, Christ's return and eternity. But the majority of everything we've read so far, preterists would look at Revelation and say, all these things have already been fulfilled. And so to do that, you have to take a pretty early writing view of Revelation. We take a later view, but they would have to say, well, Revelation must have been written in AD 50 or AD 65, somewhere in there, because all of it was fulfilled in AD 70. I think the downside of this view, and scholars think what you lose in this view, is you've got to mute a lot of the language in Revelation that talks about all tribes, all nations, a global church, global persecution, global judgment. It's not just at the end of the book. All of Revelation, throughout Revelation, has tons of language regarding, hey, like all of this is in focus here. All of this is there's something global in focus, not just regional 1-year event. It's a global book, and it's talking about a larger swath of history. So to take a preterist view that everything has already happened, you've got to, in some ways, mute a lot of Revelation. So that's preterist view. Everything already happened except for the very end. Historicism view or historicist view looks at Revelation as, okay, Revelation, some of these events have already happened, some of them haven't, but they all correspond with actual historical events. So the Pope and the rise of Catholicism, Napoleon, Hitler, these are all real figures in the book of Revelation, and they're real, literal. Some of them have been fulfilled, some of them haven't been fulfilled, but all of them have real, literal fulfillment at some point. So that's kind of the historicist view. The problem with this, or I think the downside of this, is that it tries to identify movements too specifically, and it limits these prophecies to really what we get is most of the historicist view limits these prophecies to the Western world. So there's a denial of kind of what's going on in the East, where billions of people live, and in Africa, where billions of people live, right? There's like, it focuses on the major events of the Western world at the expense of the global. And it just gets too literal. It's trying to fit things nicely into largely symbolic yet real explanations for worldly events that we find in Revelation. So that's the historicist view. The futurist view is by far the most popular view. This is the left behind view. The futurist view says, hey, Revelation, none of it's really happened. We're looking forward to all of it happening. So the futurists would say, yeah, this is all a book about what will happen. None of it really explains what is happening. None of it could have already happened. It's all going to happen in the end times, and we're awaiting it. So, this is left behind. This is any of your prophets, like your current day prophets who are talking about moon phases and trying to predict the second coming. They're all typically futurists, and it's tied with a theology called dispensationalism, which we haven't talked a lot about at Sojourn because we take a covenantal view of the Old and New Testament, where dispensationalists will do a different view of how to interpret that. There's nothing inherently heretical about that. It's just a different approach. Maybe I'll do a video soon on dispensationalists. theology. But so the futurists look at the events of Revelation, and they really link them to a pretty specific timeline. I'm going to read that timeline to you. Futurists think that first, ethnic Israel will be restored. Second, the Christians will be raptured into heaven. There will be a 7-year, third, a 7-year tribulation. Fourth, the Antichrist will reign. Fifth, evil nations will fight in Jerusalem. 6, Christ will come back as his second coming. 7, he will reign for 1,000 years. 8, Satan will finally be defeated. And 9, Christ will finally have his victory for all time, and we will reign with him forever. So the problem with this is, again, it's kind of this, it's a really new theology. The futurist view, it's pretty new on the scene. Nobody in the ancient world for the last basically 1900 years was taking this view of Revelation. They were all taking a different view, which we'll get to. But it's a new theology, and it really does put everything that Revelation is talking about, the suffering of the church, potential antichrists, nations, principalities that are evil and wicked, it puts all of that in the future. And so what we do is we grow in anxiety awaiting this future apocalypse when Revelation was meant to bless the church, and it tells us it was meant to bless the church and be about the church. So you really push everything away, where the preterists who say everything has already happened push it all back in time. The futurists push it all forward in time, and none of it really becomes relevant for today. Idealism is a way to take the book of, it's pretty close to historicism, but it interprets the book of Revelation as this really symbolic, non-literal, just purely allegorical representation of a timeless struggle between good and evil, God and Satan. So the idealist view says, okay, you're like, let's kind of, sure, these could be historical events, but instead of being literal historic events, let's just take all of this as symbolic between Christ and his church on one hand, and Satan and evil and wickedness and sin on the other, and all of this is kind of symbolic. The weakness of taking this view, this idealism view, is that it fails to connect Revelation with anything going on in history, where we really can take some steps there and say, I think this is a type of thing that Revelation is talking about right now, today, or in our past, like the rise of the Nazi Party, like the Roman Empire, right? Like the persecution of Christians today. These are things that Revelation talks about. Idealists say, well, it's really just talking about the grand struggle between evil and good, and God and Satan, and so we shouldn't get into any of that, which there's some wisdom there, but it doesn't allow us to interpret anything with any symbolism. And then finally, the fifth view is eclecticism. Eclecticism is the view that I take, and it's the view that Sojourn Montrose takes, and it might feel like a bit of a cop-out. But what eclecticism does as a view of interpretation for Revelation is kind of say, hey, all of y'all are right, and all of you are wrong. Right? There are some things in Revelation that apply to specific historical events. We looked at some of these in the letters to the 7 churches, which apply to real churches and real places dealing with real things. There are real, we'll talk about this this coming Sunday when the Bible talks about 666, the number of the beast is this man. Well, scholars think that applies to a specific Roman emperor named Nero, who was burning and persecuting Christians, right? So some of this applies to real events. Some of it does apply to AD 70. Some of the events of Revelation are predicting the fall of Jerusalem by the evil Roman Empire, which wanted to kill Christians and Jews in that time. Some of that is talking about the persecution and the martyrs that were in that time. Some of that's literal. Some of it hasn't happened. Right? So, all of the stuff about Jesus' return and no tears and no suffering, none of that has happened yet, right? We're still awaiting the day for all of that. But at the same time, we could say that some of it is happening. There have been global antichrists. There have been men, particularly probably women too, but men who have risen to power and are against the gospel of Jesus and are anti that. Nero is one of them, right? Hitler was one of them. So what eclecticism, this view, tries to do is say, like, there is truth in all of that. And as good believers and people who want to see Revelation for what it is, a real literary blessing for the church, real prophecy about real events, and real symbolism, real symbols that show us a picture of what really is happening in ways that we can understand and comprehend. There's a little bit of truth in all of this. Some of Revelation applies to things that have already happened. Some of it applies to things that will happen. Some of it applies, and a lot of it applies to this grand struggle between good and evil, God and Satan, and talks about his defeat and his bondage, Satan's bondage in the world. And so there's a lot of good we can draw out from all of these perspectives. So that's the view we take. If you think it's a cop-out, I'm totally fine with that. If you take one of these views super strongly, that's fine too. But this book is meant to be a blessing. It's meant to help us, not hurt us. It's not meant to cause us fear or complacency. It's meant to give us wisdom and unveil what is going on in the world. So those are the 5 views of Revelation and why we are centered on that last view, the eclectic view.